Good afternoon, and welcome to the Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions speaker series for our penultimate lecture. We're excited to have Stefanie DeLuca here today. I'd like to introduce the Faculty Director of Poverty Solutions, Luke Schaefer, who will introduce our speaker.
All right, welcome in the room and online. I'm so excited to have my friend and colleague, Stefanie DeLuca, here from Johns Hopkins University. She is one of the foremost qualitative mixed methods researchers on housing as well as higher education policy. So has a wonderful book, Coming of Age in the Other America, huge qualitative sample. I think really such a benchmark for how studies like that should be done, and has been working on the Hale Scholarship with Kathy Mickelmore and Sue Donarski here, that really literally changed the face of undergraduate admission. So her work's digging deeper into that. Here to talk about some of her work with Nathaniel Hindren and Raj Chetty about moves to opportunity and trying to get in the black box of that. So I could not be happier to have Steph DeLuca with us.
Well, thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Luke. It's great to be here today, and thanks for coming on a Friday. I really appreciate that. So first of all, how many economists do we have in the room? We got one economist. Okay. All right, excellent. Any sociologists? Anyone who's done qualitative work before? Okay, so that's not usually like the ratio we have, but excellent. Okay, so I'm really excited to talk about some work I've been doing for now going on 5 years, I think maybe 5 or 6 years, that's come to fruition in a set of papers I'm going to talk about. But what's really exciting about this project is not just that we were able to do some really interesting social science research, but and study and intervention to try to improve people's lives, but that the intervention itself that we were able to study and be part of was designed by partners in 2 housing authorities in Seattle, the Seattle area, the Seattle Public Housing Authority and the King County Public Housing Authority, who actually invited the research team in to help them think through their effort. As opposed to researchers sort of landing somewhere and trying to get access to data. So I think that is something really special to me about this project, in addition to the fact that it's interdisciplinary and mixed methods. And I think breaking some new ground in economics and maybe less so in sociology, but maybe you'll have to tell me what you think about that. And I've got 2 photos of families on the first slide here who are in the study. As a reminder, sometimes it's easy to forget that they're, real living human beings who are complicated and wonderful when we get down into the nitty-gritty of data. Qualitative data makes it a little easier to keep that in mind. But I also, it's my reminder to thank you for letting me make good on the promise that my team and I make to families when we talk to them, which is if you let us in and share with us, your, big and large tragedies and triumphs, that we will take your story and share it widely. And I'm at a podium, I'm a professor, and so I get to do this, but typically the families in our intervention are quiet. They don't get the loud voice. And so I feel honored to be able to be that voice for them. And I hope I render what they've told to me as effectively as I feel it was told to me in telling it to you. So there are 2 papers I'm drawing from today. One is coming out in the American Economic Review. And this is a collaboration with a number of economists, Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, and Larry Katz, Christopher Palmer, and Peter Bergman. Also Sarah Oppenheimer, who's at Opportunity Insights. These are a set of folks who are affiliated with Opportunity Insights, which is a policy lab at Harvard. And it's really exciting that what I'm going to talk about today is coming out in the American Economic Review, because as far as we know, there hasn't been a truly mixed method study ever published in the American Economic Review that has the voices of human beings and takes their words and testimony as expert knowledge to inform policy and economic models. So we're very excited about that. We dug a little bit deeper into another paper that just came out in the Russell Sage Journal of the Social Sciences. And so I'm kind of draw together lessons from both of those. And again, thanking our partners on the ground, SHA, KCHA, and then MDRC and JPAL North America helped implement the intervention. So I'm going to try to, I'm not going to do a lot of lit review and a lot of really, digging in deep to citations. Just a couple of facts as we motivate why we would think about economic opportunity in housing and neighborhoods together. Why do we think about the significance of housing in neighborhoods for social or economic mobility? So one thing that maybe some of you in the room are familiar with is the fact that we now know that children's prospects vary across the United States significantly depending on where they grow up. We sort of think of this as the geography of opportunity. We have now a good 30 plus years of interdisciplinary social science evidence that tells us neighborhoods matter. Over and above the family that a child is born into, the neighborhood that she grows up in helps shape her fate. And as my colleague Raj Chetty says, the roots of the American dream are spatial and they're local. Place matters. We have growing residential segregation by income, stagnant residential segregation by race in cities in the Midwest and Northeast. So we still have children who are living in very unequal environments. Those environments matter. What do we do about that? So we have at least, one policy I'm going to talk about today on the books called the Housing Choice Voucher Program that in theory should allow families who get this subsidy to move to neighborhoods that are safer, that have higher quality schools, that they think will be beneficial for their children. We spend over $20 billion a year on this policy. But it turns out that only about 14% of families who get a housing choice voucher end up living in low poverty, higher opportunity neighborhoods. The majority live in moderate to high poverty neighborhoods. And so there's a real lost opportunity here if we combine what we know from social science with what we know about how the housing choice voucher program works. So we have retreated from a model of subsidized housing that's providing hard units, what people think of as housing projects to poor families across the United States. The Housing Choice Voucher Program is the largest subsidized housing program in the United States. We have over 2.2 million households receiving vouchers, which cover, for some families, all of their rent. But that's only about 1 out of 4 families who actually qualifies for that subsidy. So it's like winning the lottery ticket. But housing is so expensive. We have a program on the books, but not everybody gets it. It's not like food stamps, for example. And we only have, by comparison, about 1 million hard unit public housing projects. So the housing voucher program is sort of the largest way that we have to subsidize housing for the poor. It's not the only way, but it's the one is run through HUD. We have a few other options I can talk about during Q&A, but that's the focus here. For those of you who are not housing policy wonks, some of you I know are. So one question then is, if we have a policy that's rare and precious that we know can be quite powerful, why is it that we don't see more families move to neighborhoods that are higher opportunity? More generally, we can ask the question, why do we not see more low-income families in neighborhoods that are higher opportunity? Sort of more fundamental question that may seem obvious, but it's worth thinking through a little bit, because these are the sorts of questions you want to ask to think about how to improve policy. So, one explanation on its face is just housing's expensive, so poor people can't afford it. Another is that people may prefer certain neighborhoods, and they just, some of them are going to be low income, and low income families may prefer neighborhoods like that. It may be where their family members live, or for some other set of reasons. So these are two classes of explanations. Information is in there too, and sort of going, what do people know about neighborhoods? And so the sort of preferences, economic resources, and information class of explanations is typically what economists will rely on to explain most of everything. Now, I would think more broadly about this, right? I just told you about a voucher program that pays for most of people's, households' rent. So an economic explanation is not adequate. We know this is also true when we're thinking about racial segregation. Controlling for income, we still see Black families living in neighborhoods that are lower quality than they say they would prefer. When it comes to preferences, and we look at national surveys of attitudes around where people would like to live, universally, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian families would like to live in neighborhoods that are safe and have high quality schools. Most families would tolerate some sort of diversity and in varying amounts. But preferences doesn't seem to really drive segregation the way that we might have thought a couple of decades ago. So we're really thinking about barriers here. And this is where sociologists and other policy scholars have an advantage in helping us understand why it is that we might not use policy to its full effect. Maybe families have a hard time getting housing, right? It's hard to get housing, period. If anyone in the room can remember the last time they tried to get housing, it's a bit difficult. So if we think about using the literature, what we know and what we don't know, if we're going to focus on how it is that we might remove barriers to accessing better housing through housing policy. And that's kind of where our study comes from, and is relying on decades of research and some additional practice wisdom from housing authorities across the country who have experimented with different ways to serve their clients. And so this is what Seattle and King County did. They invited us to come and be part of this study. The Gates Foundation was generous enough to fund the intervention and the research. So this is a randomized controlled field trial. So when I say RCT, how many people know what I'm talking about? Got a couple of folks. Random assignment to an intervention. Okay. So, we have what many people would consider a gold standard method for understanding causal effects as part of the design, but we also have a mixed methods research design as well. So it's not just experimental data we're relying on to understand the program. And so we're trying to test scalable strategies to remove the kinds of barriers that voucher recipients in particular face when trying to move to neighborhoods that are higher opportunity, which at baseline, most families indicate an interest in doing. So this isn't about trying to force on folks things they may not want. We have baseline survey data for over 70% of the participants in this program expressed interest in moving to neighborhoods that are classified by our definition as high opportunity, which I can talk about in a second, how we got there. But instinctively, we're talking about the kinds of places all parents would like to raise their kids, places that are safe, where they feel that their children can have an educational experience that's beneficial for them. And maybe there are other amenities like green space. So if we were to leave right now because there is a fire drill, I wouldn't want anybody to not know what it was that they should take away. Sometimes people have to leave early. And I think the takeaway here, right, is that the Creating Moves to Opportunity program overcame most of the barriers that voucher holders were facing in moving to high opportunity neighborhoods. So it was a success. It was actually, by social science standards, a pretty big success. So in the treatment group, when compared to the control group, 53% of those families relocated to higher opportunity neighborhoods versus the 15% in the control group, which is a 38 percentage point difference, which is big in social science intervention terms. And it's also big substantively when we look at the historical rates of voucher holders in this area moving to higher opportunity neighborhoods. It's about 11.5%. So it's a big difference. How did this happen? So was it that there was better information about neighborhoods, that low-income families in the area didn't know there were better neighborhoods or didn't know where they were? Is it that there was some financial incentives that came with the voucher itself? It's really offsetting rent. There was some additional, as I'll get into in a minute, financial resources. No, most economists would have just stopped there. I can pick fun because my colleagues are economists, but I think truly, right, what's interesting here is the benefit of having an interdisciplinary team and sort of probing more deeply through mixed methods work to think about what it is we actually found out was the secret sauce that made the intervention so effective. It turns out that it's intervention staff, the human beings that families interacted with, that mattered most. Now, the financial resources matter, right? Housing's expensive, but we already know families are getting vouchers. They're not using it in the kinds of neighborhoods they say they'd like to. So we know it's not enough. But what gets families over the edge? So it's the housing navigators that worked in the program who provided emotional and instrumental support through high quality communication and the conferral of dignity and choice to families who kept them optimistic during difficult housing searches and sometimes demoralizing experiences with landlords. That's what we found. Now, how do we get there? Why should you believe us, right? That's the rest of the story. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program is right, this precious subsidy. The families have said to me, it's like, I feel like it was the day I won the lottery, when something is so rare and so important and you've waited so long to get it. But it's also the kind of program that you have to, as Carolyn Barnes calls it, you redeem the redemption cost to getting the voucher. You don't just get it in your bank account. It's like, it's like SNAP, that you still have to actually redeem to get food, but you have to take this voucher and find a place to live. I'm going to throw a bunch of details out at you quickly that help us understand how complicated it is. And I won't go through them very slowly because that's actually not how respondents and participants get this information. It's a huge blast at them, right? So we know that the housing vouchers are rare. Wait lists may be long. Wait lists are unpredictable. When is your number going to come up? You're not sure. Did you move? Did your address get updated? The housing authority? Did your income change? You have to change your eligibility requirements, right? You got to keep on this stuff. It's very taxing, right? Briefings are 3 hours sometimes. That's a lot of information. That's just getting your voucher. How do you get a place to live? You don't have a lot of time. It's not endless search time, right? You have anywhere from 60 to 120 days, depending on how generous the housing authority wants to be with its staff, right? Searches are taxing and they're stressful for parents who are juggling sometimes multiple jobs, caregiving responsibilities, and in the case of Seattle, extraordinary traffic, as our research team understands now all too well. Also, there's that experience of working with landlords who may discriminate against you for reasons that are legal or illegal or anything in between. So it's kind of demoralizing and can really be an embarrassing situation. Sometimes landlords have a lot of hoops they have to jump through to be able to provide a unit to somebody with a voucher. Then there's finding a neighborhood that you feel good about living in with your kids. So that's a whole nother story, right? How a lot of families are not, experienced with some of these neighborhoods and some of these housing markets. So landlords are not familiar. So it's difficult for them to know what to do with vouchers. Sometimes they don't understand the program. You get rejected a lot. Credit scores come up. So this is intense, right? It's taxing, burdensome, and families just want to get a place to live. So when you get this voucher, right, it's hard enough to find a place to live. It can be nearly unimaginable to find a place to live that's desirable for you and your kids. What we've learned from families in 5 different cities is that under constraints, which is what housing searches look like for the poor, families take what they can get. You don't have time to wait around and lose an opportunity because the alternative is homelessness or living, with someone who's hurting you at home or living in some sort of conflict-laden situation. So timing is of the essence. So, right, this is part of why we understand vouchers are hard to use. How do we do better than that? Before we get there, I'm just going to say a couple of words about how it is we defined opportunity areas. This is sort of one of the more contentious aspects of this, this area of research. We can get very technical on it. I don't want to do that. I think the gut sense of what we think of as an area that provides opportunity for kids is probably right. How we go about defining it, people debate about. But in this particular instance, this is neighborhoods that where my colleagues, Rod Shetty, Nathan Hendren, and Larry Katz have come up with a way of using data on children who've grown up in neighborhoods, how much money they earn when they're adults, and use that as a measure of how social and economic mobility enhancing a place is, as opposed to just saying, is it a place that's high poverty or a place with high unemployment rates? It's sort of like, well, what happens to kids who grow up in these places? And taking the upper third of the distribution of places based on the adult income of children who grew up there. So do neighborhoods do well by the kids who grew up there? That's kind of how opportunity areas get defined here. But of course, whenever you're doing anything in the field, you have to contend with the local wisdom and practice being better than what you could come up with in your research office. And so working with the housing authorities to kind of tweak some of these areas was very key here. So this is what a map of opportunity areas looks like. We could dig into this for the country. We could dig into this for the Michigan area, the Detroit, Ann Arbor metro area. But it kind of looks like this, where you can see there are some places in blue where children earn quite a bit more as adults than the areas in red. There's a lot of variation here. What you will also notice is that the east side of King County is more blue than it is red or orange. So children growing up in those census tracts earn more as adults than children in South Seattle, say, or in the west side of King County, which is where actually you'll also see the green map points, which is where most of the voucher holders in the Seattle and King County housing authorities, where they live. Okay, so part of this is trying to better, help families access neighborhoods like Bellevue or North Seattle, where again, we heard in interviews families, mentioned wanting to live in. I think there's a lot of complicated issues whenever thinking about, doing interventions, because there's sort of, what does the research say? And then there's sort of, well, what do people want to do? And how heavy-handed can you be? And so we can talk about that during Q&A a little bit. There's a fine balance there. So the key elements in this intervention involve sort of 3 buckets of resources. So these are resources that are all administered in effective ways, which is part of, again, the learning here by housing navigators who dealt with families one-on-one. So the first bucket is really about housing search assistance. And so there's some working with maps that navigators do with families when they sit down and say, as we spend some time observing these activities, let's look at a map of the area. So there are some places here where if you decide to move there, try to search for housing there, we can give you some extra resources. We can give you up to $3,500 in additional moving costs if you're open to, searching in some of these opportunity areas. So that's the short-term financial assistance. Let's talk about what you want in this map. So there are these one-on-one meetings, right, around search assistance and some additional supports that I'll talk about when I present more of the qualitative data. There are referrals to units. Connections are made with landlords. Brokering is done with landlords. The key piece of the story is actually landlords, and landlords often get left out of the story or sort of like dismissed as, the evil people when we think about the affordable housing market. And it's not so necessarily. And we can also talk more about that. But interacting with landlords was a really key piece here for helping families get access to places to live, because landlords are the ones who own those places, and being able to work with them in ways that are also respectful of their business practices is a key policy ingredient. So there's search assistance, one-on-one conversations, support goes on through the search, landlord engagement, and then the short-term financial assistance. So a typical voucher process can take anywhere from 2 to 10 years to get a voucher. I mean, it's hard to stress enough just how difficult it is to get a voucher, how long it takes, and just how anxiety provoking the whole situation is. So the services that are layered in from the Creating Moves to Opportunity Intervention, they're layered in along the process of getting the voucher issuance, searching for a place to live, and additional assistance at the lease up moment, which is where it turns out some of the most important interactions between families and navigators happened when landlords started to get, say, cold feet about somebody who might have poor credit. This was a really, really important moment right at that, about to sign the lease, instance in that moment. So the experimental design that we used, right, it had a sampling frame of families with children who, at least one child was below the age of 15, in part because the literature to date has pointed to the fact that neighborhood environments seem to be more impactful the younger children are. So that was one decision that was made. That families were taken from the existing wait list that the Housing Authority had. So we had 2 phases of the RCT. I may not get to the second one, but I'll definitely tell you how it folds into the rest. But there were 430 families, and they were split randomly into a treatment and control group. Everyone got a voucher. This is an important detail. That's not true in all housing policy interventions. The control group got sort of the standard services from the housing authorities, and the treatment group got the offer of those 3 buckets of resources if they were willing to search in neighborhoods that were in the higher opportunity areas, but they weren't required to do so. So it was entirely voluntary. So we did this work between 2018 and 2020 through the pandemic, and we had been doing field work all along the way. We think it was important to layer in the qualitative work for a number of reasons. For those of you who've done qualitative work, which seems to be more folks than not in the room, which is excellent. We thought it was important to have a sampling strategy for the qualitative work that allowed us to be able to say something generalizable about the folks who were in the program. So we wanted to make sure we got families who were in the search process, finished searching, and get 80% of everyone we tried to get. So we would get the hardest to talk to people, the easiest to want to be interviewed people, and everyone in between. And we were able to get in phase 1 an 80% response rate. How we do that involves everything from a phone call to knocking on somebody's door with pie, which no one does, it turns out. And we'd be in trouble if people started doing this and using our game. Door knocking, shoe leather, trying to catch people as they're coming home and saying, we're the people who've been calling. We just wanted to make sure you didn't miss an opportunity to be part of our study. Phase 2 was more difficult because we did a lot of those interviews remotely, but we were able to still get 70% of the folks that we wanted to get. So who are the families in this study? Right, so this turns out to be a relatively diverse group of families by nativity and race, ethnicity. But what all of these families have in common is that they're low income and extremely rent burdened, right? So the pooled mean income for families between both the treatment and control groups is about $20,000 in, I think it's $21. So that seems low, right? But when compared to the area median income in Seattle, which is about $100,000 a year, it's extremely low. Seattle's one of the most expensive places to live in the U.S. So doing a housing intervention there was its own sort of adventure, right? It's a place where landlords, for example, could get lots of people to rent their property. Why would they take a chance on a program they don't understand or families they may have preconceived notions about? Again, this is why the intervention was so helpful and why the staff were so vital. Another thing to note about the families in the sample that won't surprise those of you with social work backgrounds, social science backgrounds, who've worked in the community with families who are working poor, at poor, extremely poor, or even middle class and struggling, right, is that there's a lot of trauma that can come with poverty. So it's not just the financial difficulties. It's a cluster of challenging life circumstances. And so when we did the interviews, what we learned just by sort of getting a sense of families' histories was that over 40% of the families we talked to had been homeless at some point. We had what's an interesting note here is this is the baseline survey that was done at the beginning of the study. And through the qualitative interviews, we found rates of homelessness that were much higher than the survey did because we got full residential histories. Sort of a small note there. When we really dug in and said, tell me the story of your life. So it's another valuable thing in measurement terms about doing interviews. Over 40% had some issue with credit, some sort of credit scoring report, not having credit, which turns out to be really important, increasingly for renters in the United States, not just people trying to buy homes. Over 40% had some sort of health shock themselves or with a close family member that was very costly. And, over 50% had experienced some sort of trauma, sexual, emotional, psychological abuse or violence. Why I belabor that point is because it speaks again the importance of understanding the families who are showing up to be part of this intervention and why the people who delivered the services and how they did it were so important. It's not just about handing out maps and just about giving financial subsidies. It's actually a process of dignity, quality communication, and understanding where people are. And that may seem, again, to many of you in the room like a really sensible thing, but it's not how we do most of our social policy in the United States. So again, the money slide here, right, is the experimental impact slide. But I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on this because the how we got there is the interesting story because it's important for understanding how to scale this kind of an intervention. So we see this 38 percentage point difference between the treatment and control group in terms of the proportion of families who leased up in high opportunity neighborhoods against the backdrop of an historical mean rate of 11.6% in the area, right? So very few voucher holders are finding their ways into some of the highest performing school districts in the metro area. So results like this were pretty striking. And, you show results like this to sociologists, developmental psychologists, social work scholars, and policy scholars, you may get a set of answers about what might have happened here. You show these results to a set of economists, you may get another set of explanations. And that's where things get interesting. Before we get there, we sort of looked at some subgroup heterogeneity of the different kinds of families. So we had native-born African-American families. We had families who were born in other countries. The folks we interviewed came from 14 different countries. So we actually also had to juggle translation services and some other things for this study that were important to be able to get everyone's perspectives. But the experimental impact was large across all of these subgroups, but we do see that there was a difference between white and Black non-Hispanic families in terms of the effect size. And we didn't see this in the second phase of the experiment, but we can talk more about why that might have been, and we've spent some time trying to think about that. But the bottom line is the experimental impacts held across subgroups you might suspect that they wouldn't. Families who had some homelessness experience were doubled up at the time of lease up. Larger families with extremely low incomes, we still see uniformly large experimental effects. Why? So this is where the fieldwork comes in. It is in my mind. In this case, we actually had fieldwork and a second RCT, which most studies don't have. But I think if we had just ended with the phase 1 fieldwork, it turns out we'd have had the same answer as we got at the end of the second RCT. Why fieldwork? Why talk to people? So this is not a hard sell in lots of places, but it is a hard sell, say, to traditionally quantitative researchers. right? And so we're at a moment now where I'm optimistic and think there's a more fertile environment for mixed methods work. The use of qualitative work is becoming, it's a warmer environment for such work, but there's lots of debates. Why is it, though, that we talk to fewer people about stuff that's important? What's the benefit of doing that? So part of the idea here, right, is that I think what we want to do is give people the power to tell their own stories and confer expertise on families. For example, in this case, sometimes it's students who are applying to college in another one of my studies. So we want to learn from you, because part of the problem is sitting in our offices on campus, we may miss some really key explanations. We want to have some surprises, right, that we might not see based on our own experiences come up through the field work. And so what our interviews allow us to do is kind of flip the traditional script that goes into action when low-income families are asked about their behavior. And say, I'm going to be the student today, you be the teacher. And tell me about your life. Tell me what it's like to participate in this program. I've got all day, and there's nothing more important on my plate than this conversation. So let's do it. And that process, a whole talk in of itself, right, really turned out to be incredibly important in this particular instance. And how we did the interviews and the coding, we can also discuss. But one of the things we do at the outset is sort of give out this invitation to tell me the story of your life. Most of the questions in the interview guide are invitations to tell me more about that. Tell me about the Creating Moves to Opportunity program. Go, right? And then sort of see what comes up. And through that conversation, we have some systematic questions, that things we do want to know about that we ask as probes, allowing for emergent inductive surprises in everyday life that help us do better research and better policy. That's the aim. We're not limited by our own imagination as researchers, which turns out sometimes to be a little narrow. Or, in the words of Sandy Jenks, an eminent sociologist at Harvard, when talking about Kathy Eden's qualitative work in an issue of Mother Jones about 10 years ago, said, it's really better to get interviews and observations of people who are willing to trust you and tell you the truth than it is to get a random sample of the population who would lie to you. Now, I think Sandy mostly always says it better than anyone else can, but I think part of it is really about that rapport and what do you get there. Key pieces, however, involve sampling and other design elements around data collection, coding, and being able to have what I think are important collaborative teams of people. What does that mean? It means that I take a whole bunch of young, fresh minds all over the country, in this case, Seattle. Lots of students wanted to sign up for this trip. I wonder why. Not so much for the Dallas or Cleveland study, puzzling. Everybody was up for going to Seattle. It turns out, I wonder, there's a lot more things to do on the weekends in Seattle if you're interested in hiking and coffee shops. So these are my team members. There are lots of them. In this study alone, 80 plus different students at Hopkins worked with me to make this possible, not counting our partners at Harvard, JPAL, and MDRC. This is an enormous study, but it really took a lot of work. And I really think there's a lot of value in collaboration. So no one person can get an idea in his or her mind and be wrong and not challenge an idea. My students are in the same homes, sometimes following up with families that I talk to, the same communities. Different sets of students who did interview are coding the data, but they deserve credit. They're not at the podium, but I wanted their pictures to be up here so you could understand it's not just me. I can't take all the credit for this. Okay, so what was it that where it was undergirding the experimental impacts? Again, the reviewers of the journal, the economic journal, really wanted us to convince them it wasn't about information. And it wasn't about the financial incentive of having a voucher that's worth more money in the rental market that swayed families to move somewhere different. We could deliberate why that makes a lot of sense, and why the neoclassical canon of the rational actor model economics makes sense or not. But that's not really what we found was driving these results. We found a number of other mechanisms that jumped out of these interviews, even as early as the pilot stage, including the extent to which families felt supported emotionally by the navigators, that they were excited to be part of something that wasn't just about paying rent, but was about living in neighborhoods that they long wanted to live in but never thought they could, streamlining, reducing bandwidth tax and the cost of juggling, the brokering with landlords, and the way that the financial assistance was used. So we learned this by watching the navigators who are in the upper left-hand corner there do their work. And some of the families letting us hang out during the briefings. There were some group briefings. We also did some one-on-one sessions and watched those happen as well. And so what you see here is a bright, beautiful set of conference rooms. There were tote bags, water bottles. People were sat down and treated well, invited to come and learn about an opportunity. This turns out to be pretty important psychologically, given what families had experienced in other social service agencies and other times. And questions, as Tier is speaking on the lower left-hand panel to a father, people could ask questions. Then the group joined in questions, and it was a really collaborative. Even the group sessions were quite collaborative. Watching that happen was interesting, and the approach that even the folks who were doing the group briefings were taking had an enthusiasm and an optimism that was infectious. So what was it like for families in the control group to search without the assistance of the program? So Jasmine, a white mother, had said to one of my students, well, he said, tell us how, you use the voucher, talk about your search. On the weekend, me and the boys, I would come over and, go to the place where we could use the voucher. They were in King County and got a Seattle voucher. We would get a room for the night. And during the whole day on Saturday, we would call and visit places. So you see that time taxing. Fadumo, okay. Fadumo, a Somali mom, and said to another one of the research team members, she paid application fees for several places and wasn't, able to get it. One place was too old. Landlord said the other places were, quote, taken. She turned to my student and said, do you have someone who can help me find a place to live? Anyone who can help? And Amy, a Black mom in Seattle, said, what made it so hard, right, is when landlords tell you that, you tell them you have Section 8, they look at you like you're crap. And this, ties also into, we're not approving you because of your credit or the voucher. It's illegal in the state of Washington and the city of Seattle and King County to discriminate against families on the basis of the source of income they use to try to get housing. But income is not a protected class under federal fair housing law. There are more states and cities that have source of income discrimination protection on the books, but it's still perfectly legal to discriminate against, in most places, against families who have a voucher. You can't discriminate on the basis of race, family status, religion, right? They're protected classes, but income isn't one of them. And so, this becomes a difficult hurdle sometimes because credit and other things that go along with income turn landlords off. So the navigators we also interviewed, about what it was like to work with families, and what you'll hear from families resonates a lot with this comment, and which I thought was interesting because this interview happened much earlier on. And one of the navigators had said to a member of the MDRC implementation team, actually not to us, when trying to understand how implementation fidelity was going. I think the main components so far of the program, like these meetings, right, are for me to get to know a family, understand their barriers, build a relationship, collaborate together, and see what their needs are, what they want from the move and for their kids, right? This is not a typical sort of framework, at least not from families' perspectives, for what happens when they go somewhere and ask for something they need. What we heard from families who were in the treatment group and who got the offer for the services, just jumped off of these interviews, like I said, right away from the pilot. So Jackie, a white mom who moved to Issaquah, said to me, when I did the meeting and started getting this help, it was like a light bulb went on. She says later in the interview, it felt like someone fed me emotionally. It was this whole flood of relief, this whole flood of, I didn't know what I was going to do and how I was going to move my son. I don't know what I'm going to do. It's not working, but I think it was a supportive nature and having lots of conversations with the navigators really did it for me. Melinda said it, that it was not just to get rent. She said, they made me cry when they explained to me that the program does not just pay your rent, but it's to make sure that your kid can grow up in a good area and be successful. It's like made me so happy to think that my son is going to be in an area that can help him being a good member of society. So the idea that neighborhoods matter wasn't new to families on some instinctive level. Interestingly enough, the pitch at the beginning of the study, the invitation to be part of the study, talked about the research on neighborhoods being important for kids. And that pitch resonated and families brought it up actually quite a bit when we didn't ask them about their intake session, but it came up, it resonated with them. Lisa talked about sort of the streamlining benefits of working with the navigators. It was like I'm staring at my phone where I'm looking for places while my son is playing around, and I have less time to be with him. So it's like anything that's going to take away from me focusing on him, the other things I need to do, the better. Brokering with landlords was also a key piece here. As I mentioned, it can be really embarrassing and it feels bad to be rejected over and over again, which was happening a lot. So credit products are available to landlords in a way they weren't more than 10 years ago. And so this is sort of in and of itself a really interesting area, I think, of research. And as Leah said, the navigator said to me, when you go to find a place, I'll come with you. And in some cases, this is what navigators said. Some families didn't ask for this much support, right? Part of the point here, is I'll get to in a second, was the support was quite customized. But Leah said, she told me, I'll come with you, I'll help you fill out the application, talk to the landlord, help you with things that might be complicated. Jennifer said, actually, I had this issue where I had still money to pay off on my last apartment before I could get the new place. And the navigator was able to get me the financial assistance and be able to take care of that part of the rent, and then, be able to help me get into the new place because they understood my situation, the situation I was in, which is one of the valuable aspects of this. We dug a little bit deeper in the second paper in the Russell Sage Journal, but what were these components during these sessions, the communication itself that was so important? Some of this I've already weaved through, but I think we took a look really closely at what was going on as families described their interactions, what we saw in our field notes. So the communication and interactions that families had with navigators were characterized by a communication that was established, accessible, collaborative, and useful and pertinent, right? Families had a sense, these people know what they're talking about, so I'm going to listen to them. They were able to get responses quickly. And text messages or phone calls back. They had access in a way as they needed it. And Simone sums up the customization in a way I thought was really striking. She says the navigator might have thought maybe up front I was going to be like one of these needy cases. Okay, so I didn't have the mental capacity to handle certain things. So initially she didn't understand. I just need a list of some places that take Section 8. And I'm not going to be going through drama. Let's get to the point. Give me what I really need. Let's go from there. Whereas other families talked about, or much more of a heavy touch hand-holding approach. Stasia, one of the moms in Renton, an area in King County I interviewed, sort of talked about her initial impression of of being with a navigator as one where it surprised her that they weren't, quote, going to take something away. She said, at first I was like, I don't want to do this program. My experience is they're going to look for flaws in your story and stop what you're trying to do. But the navigator said, this is optional. You don't have to do it. They don't want to ruin something for you or take it away. That was my fear. I was asking them questions more out of fear and anxiety, but they were so nice about it. So you get this sense that there were some experiences that families may have had with other service providers who were also, overburdened themselves, but that, made them feel, maybe they wouldn't take up services. I think this is a non-trivial piece of the story. In terms of the collaborative aspect of this, I think this was another important piece of the way navigators handled the services. So it wasn't just families being told what to do to get something or, being instructed. They had to also search for housing themselves, which turned out to be something that helped, them feel like they were owning that process. This was a process about what they wanted as well. As Aaliyah said, they were involving me in things in these meetings. Nicole said it's 50-50. You're looking for the place too. And Sarah said, they know what I'm up against. I'm literally crying on the phone with them. And they're like, we'll pivot. We'll do something else. They never made me feel like a burden, right? She says, they made me feel like they were working with me, not talking to me. So what this sort of approach in communication and meetings, interactions, what that did was made families feel cared about, which turns out to have built up a sense of optimism and excitement for the opportunity to search for housing, as opposed to it being something difficult and taxing, right? And having to spend your weekend searching. So we argue that the program helped bolster confidence during these complex housing searches and opportunity areas and increase trust in the navigators as advocates who understood what families wanted. And again, as I mentioned, this was important given what families were coming to the program with and what they'd experienced in their lives. Like, it wasn't just that there was a straightforward approach to housing that was going to happen in 2 weeks, right? There are lots of different moving parts, especially for some of the survivors of domestic violence, for example. Steve, a white Russian immigrant father, said to me, when someone cares about you, it's priceless. So I'll just go through a couple of these really quickly, but they're part of the multiple quotes on this slide. Part of the reason to do that is to show right there, this is happening across a number of participants. They're saying these things, different family backgrounds, different race, ethnic groups, using some of the same language about confidence. Katie, a young first-time leaseholder mom I interviewed in Seattle, it said, I thought I was just after a month of searching with this voucher going to have to give it back and just live back with my mom. 1 month down, I have to give it back. I didn't feel like I was going to find anything. And then literally, I got this with the program. They gave me some confidence. 3 weeks later, right, I was able to be in a place. Lee said, it's hard not to be tongue-tied and nervous with landlords. So one of the things the navigators did is had families write up a rental resume script with which to approach landlords to say, hey, when you search my credit, you're going to find something. And let me tell you what happened that led to that credit mark and what I'm doing to fix that now. And so families were able to write a different story and present that to landlords, which went over actually really well with landlords, because then landlords felt like they were getting to know someone and feeling better about renting a house to a person and a family versus looking at an algorithm. Odyssey says the best part about CMTO was that they make you comfortable with the idea of doing something new. They give you the resources, but also a roadmap to why it can't fail, right? You feel more confident this is going to work. And Sarah, right, talks about, again, this credit report, feeling better about approaching landlords, more confident about approaching landlords, because the credit report and the way the rental resume worked allowed her to present this to landlords as if she says, it's a blip on the radar instead of being the whole picture of who I am. I'll skip through this slide, but the part of the failure and rejection with the landlords was also something that really set families back and made a lot of them want to just take an apartment that maybe was less than. But another thing the program did was sort of normalize failure in the housing search as something to be expected and normal. And so that went a long way as well. In terms of being able to support families doing longer searches, because sometimes these searches took 4 months or 5 months. So the qualitative data from phase 1 really told a story about the importance of the people, not just the resources and the information, but we did have a second RCT where the resources were unbundled and there was a lighter touch package, also a control group, a package, a treatment arm that just got financial assistance, a treatment arm that got a lot less of the navigator's time and lower amount of financial assistance, and then a third arm that was the same arm as phase 1. And what you'll see here is that phase 1, almost to the same percentage point, was the most effective package for our families in the treatment group to move to opportunity areas. And we did qualitative work in phase 2 as well, which echoed moments in each of these treatment arms where families hit the barriers that they would have gotten support for in one of the other treatment arms, but couldn't. And so they didn't end up maybe moving somewhere that they wanted to in an opportunity area. It also tells us that the mechanisms we found in the qualitative work are probably right. The navigators are the secret sauce in that full bundle. More of their time and having their time customize it really, save the day and really made a difference for families. So in conclusion, we learned, I think, a number of things are important for housing policy, but social policy in general. But one thing that is a contribution is sometimes it seems that problems are intractable and insurmountable, that you almost can't do anything. And to be clear, this is one program and one intervention and one policy. But at least for the social science and economics, one of the important lessons was that the neighborhood locations of families aren't largely a result of preferences. Sociologists find it hard that this has to be said, but this is more about barriers. But then also, these barriers can be overcome with seemingly small amounts of resources. So the marginal cost of the program was about $2,600. And the value of a voucher over 7 years, could range anywhere, depends where in the country, from $12,000 to $20,000. So in Seattle, it was about a 2% marginal cost. And families spent about 6 hours total on average with navigators and only used about $1,000 on average of the financial resources. So seemingly small, but not free, intervention could make such a difference. There are other issues that remain. What do we do? Some of the families didn't want to move. About a third of the families, actually closer to 40% in phase 1 didn't move to higher opportunity areas in the treatment group. Why is that? We're learning more about that in some additional work we're doing. But a takeaway here is that CMTO worked and helped increase the proportion of families moving to higher opportunity neighborhoods, not just because it changed what was offered to families, but how it was delivered, how the services were provided. Landlords were affected by these services too. They also felt supported, like they had someone to call, so that made them more interested in being part of the program. Imagine something so low cost as a phone call for a landlord to turn, the tide from renting to a voucher holder from not. Other domains where it turns out that treating people well might make a difference include education sector. There are some RCTs on with community college students showing wraparound services are beneficial for increasing associate's degree graduation rates. There are some additional evidence in sectoral labor market programs like the Work Advance programs and Perscolas. There's evidence, some new work that Phil Ariopoulos and team have put out in some cash assistance welfare programs. The navigators make a difference. So this is something that's growing in significance. And wouldn't it be great if this could add up to a message to local, state, and federal agencies that people should be treated with dignity, high quality communication, and collaborative spirit? So I think another big takeaway from the work at sort of a design level is I think if we want to have effective policy experiments, we need to have mixed methods designs to identify mechanisms to generate good hypotheses and then test that. But also we need to have the qualitative work to understand what it is about policies that work, because you can't scale policies if you don't know how they work. You can spend millions on RCTs, but if there's a black box in terms of the mechanism, how they really worked, then scaling them is almost impossible, or certainly not cost effective. This turned out to be the case with a number of pieces of legislation that were motivated by the work that my colleagues had done, and including some of this work that we've done. So Congress has appropriated more than $50 million to be used in now 9 sites across the country to expand this kind of a program. In what is now called the Community Choice Demonstration Program that's active right now. And most of these sites have gotten out of the pilot phase. So this is a scalability test that's really exciting to be able to test some of these ideas from Seattle and see how they work in other field sites. Another piece of legislation that was introduced in 2019, but reintroduced by Todd Young and Chris Van Hollen, Todd Young, a Republican from Indiana, and Chris Van Hollen, a Democrat from Maryland, was a program to increase the number of vouchers that the U.S. has by 250,000. And importantly, to have resources in that legislation, to include resources that will allow for, as they say in the bill, the proposal, customized approach to enable successful transition to opportunity varies with children. And that customized approach really comes out of the mixed methods work. And so it's really great to see that be a way to communicate to legislators what's going to make a difference. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions, comments, criticisms, and everything in between. Thank you.
What questions do we have for Stefanie? So the housing voucher, it is Section 8, essentially.
And so it got a name change a little while ago because people were wanting to emphasize the choice aspect of the program, but families still often refer to it as Section 8.
I also want to ask, how did you pick the participants? Like, were you choosing like certain areas of Seattle? Like we saw that, the West Seattle and South Seattle kind of had redder areas. Maybe there had a low opportunity compared to like the northern part and eastern part.
So the selection into the intervention, I can talk about, and then the qualitative study I can talk about. So the intervention, families were selected off the wait list. And so how exactly, it's a little bit complicated. Wait lists are actually really complicated administrative piece of the voucher program. But families who were on the wait list who had signed up for housing vouchers were selected, with a systematic approach. So they were from all over the place, and families ended up moving sort of, all across the area. So it wasn't just moves concentrated in any one place or voucher holders originating from any one place. For the qualitative study, we did a stratified random sample of participants in the experiment. So we looked at, so we took strata, so we clumped families by whether they were moving still or not, whether they were in Seattle or in King County. And we also used the treatment versus control as a distinction. And then we randomly sampled families in each of those cells to get 202 families, and we got 161 of those families. And so we were able to have a really nice range. So the systematic sampling in quantitative work often doesn't take much to explain why you would do that. And in qualitative work, I think some of the same scientific principles obtain. You want to get a range of different perspectives. You want to be able to get both maybe folks that you thought, or maybe based on stereotypes or even literature reviews who would be a typical housing voucher family, whatever that means, right? Which turns out to be not any one person. You want to be able to talk to people who are unemployed, who are employed, are more likely to have pulled a flyer and less likely to have pulled a flyer, or to get sort of what I like to think of as maybe known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, the things that matter that we can't see. And so we trust the sampling design and the high response rate and the high quality interviews to be able to yield some of these surprises that help us come up with better explanations.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'm a PhD student in statistics, so it's great to not just work exclusively quantitatively and hear more about mixed methods work. It's very interesting. My question was regarding, you were speaking with about how there might have been multiple explanations for why landlords chose to finally get over discriminatory, not get over discriminatory practices, but make that jump. Did you speak with, did you interview with them, and was that, what was like a primary reason?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we did some pilot landlord interviews in Seattle. It turned out COVID was more detrimental for our landlord study in Seattle than the family study. Landlords and property owners are hard to pin down. They often have day jobs and multiple properties. And if they're not close, they're very busy and hard to pin down. And so being in person is key. So we talked to a few landlords in Seattle. MDRC had talked to some landlords as part of the implementation research, but we talked to landlords in 3 other cities just a couple of years before we started the Seattle work. So we talked to 156 landlords, a stratified random sample of landlords across the housing market since Cleveland, Dallas, and Baltimore. We looked at neighborhoods that were high, low income and at different racial compositions, and scraped Craigslist ads and recruited landlords that way. And what was interesting to us, landlords for whom, any low-income families in that a study could potentially rent from, below, say, fair market rent amount. And many of the landlords we interviewed in that study had already participated in the voucher program and stopped because they found it cumbersome. So administrative burdens are not just things that families have to bear, but also landlords too. We had a companion study in Baltimore for a program that was a lot like the Seattle program that actually informed some of the intervention in Seattle, the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, which is a remedy from a class action desegregation lawsuit, where those landlords had gotten some connections and relationships from staff too. And we interviewed them and compared them to the landlords who hadn't had that. And we heard some of the similar things as we heard from families, which is, I just want someone to call. Some landlords went so far as to say, I went into the business to help people. I interviewed a landlord in Dallas, and that's why she did it. She was a domestic violence survivor and wanted to give women housing. And so landlords are an interesting group of people and often defy expectations. But part of it was just the worry that, and it's reasonable, one might lose money. So if you still owe money so the smaller owners on a single family home or some small number of under 20 apartment units, you still have mortgages on those properties. Having to go through the paperwork and waiting process and the housing inspection process for a voucher in a landlord mind almost definitely ensures you're going to have vacancy and you're going to lose money. And so part of what the program did in Seattle was expedite inspections, which also really helped in the Baltimore program too. So landlords were treated like, business people who shouldn't lose money. And that went a long way. In addition to having a phone number one landlord said, someone will answer if I call, if I have a question. The other thing that the program did in Seattle is they provided a damage guarantee fund for up to, I think it was $2,500. So if something happened, landlords would be covered up to $2,500. And it turns out it was virtually never used. So it's like a free, in some ways, a free, very low cost additional subsidy, but really made a difference in terms of how landlords felt about leasing to folks who maybe they wouldn't have before. And then in our Cleveland, Dallas, and Baltimore study, landlords still told us more than half actually had participated in the voucher program in their cities. They still didn't understand how it worked. Whereas in the Seattle program, there was the navigators talked to landlords at length through the process. And, a moment where landlords would sort of get cold feet is after running a credit report or maybe seeing an eviction on someone's record and sort of being like, I don't know. And then the navigator was able to say, what if we increase the security deposit, which is how some of those flexible funds were used. And then landlords felt a little better. But also meeting families in person and having some of their stories was helpful. So the takeaway in many ways is landlords are people too. I think a lot of our common, visions of landlords and maybe some of our own bad experiences might suggest otherwise. And we certainly saw some shady landlords in Cleveland, in Dallas, and Baltimore, but we also saw a lot of business people who are providing low-income families with housing opportunities. And if we don't support them, then we're in real trouble because we don't build public housing anymore. Housing isn't getting any cheaper. And we have to rely for, in many cases for worse, for subsidized housing in the private market. So we have to get this straight too. And so another piece of legislation that I talked to some staff about for Senators Kramer and Kuhn was a bill to actually provide some additional support for landlords who participate in the voucher program at the federal level. So that didn't end up getting funded, but may be reintroduced.
So thanks so much for sharing this. It's really fascinating to learn about what's the experiences of the families. So I'm wondering how long the families are engaged in the program and how long they're receiving this assistance, because we know that, it's not just about finding a place, it's about staying in a place and keeping the place, right? So how are there assistance in sort of helping as like, do the navigators stay until a year or something as mediators,
So the program itself, sort of the active, the workshops and the search could take anywhere from 1 month to 6 months, right? So it kind of depends on how move-ready families felt. Some families maybe had a clear idea about where they wanted to live. Some of it aligned already with opportunity areas, and it was more a little bit smoother. And for some families, it was very difficult with these repeated rejections and having to shore up confidence again. So that varied. So the post-move services is something that the housing authorities talked a lot about, the staff talked a lot about, wasn't provided as part of CMTO. It was provided in the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program I studied. So there were up to 3 or 4 visits for 18 months post initial move. And that I think was really, really helpful. But I think it's still something the housing authorities are thinking about as they're bringing the program in-house now after the intervention. So it's always a matter of cost. It turns out, maybe not surprisingly, that housing authorities are not exactly flush with money. HUD itself is not exactly the best, funded federal agency. Often there are calls to abolish HUD made by some Republican legislators. So it's there's not a lot of money. And so they're very tough decisions that have to get made. You could even ask a tougher question, right? Like, well, why spend any extra money helping families move to a particular type of neighborhood when you should just try to help families with getting more vouchers? I mean, these are real policy trade-offs, right? And so I think the post-move assistance is one of those. I think that, and we'll see what some of the other sites end up doing, because they can certainly add that if they want to. In the very near term, in that first year, especially in that first year, there were occasionally some difficulties with the unit as soon as it got leased up or within a month. And for that kind of thing, navigators were still able to help in that window. But we've been following up with families as recently as last January. And we're about to do a final set of follow-ups in any minute now, the context have gone out, to sort of learn more about the challenges families might have faced, how they've gotten to know their neighbors if they have post-COVID and everything. And we also have in the new version of the paper persistence results. So most families are still in the same unit. And this was up to, I think for phase 1, 3 years, 36 months post. There is very few families. It's like a 6 percentage point difference for families who moved into opportunity years who were still there up to 3 years later. So the housing itself provides a stability, right? That often all of the other things that make it difficult to get housing, create stability. The housing itself, and this is at the basis of a lot of housing first models anyway, right? Which is if we can get people housed, it can create a stability. And so we're seeing that, but there's still families who will say, I wish, I think I want to move again. I wish that program was still there. But also I know the kind of place I want to live. And so there are some spillover learnings there.
Good afternoon. Is this on? I'm Peter Allen. I'm a real estate developer. Have been for 50 years. And I've taught real estate development at the Austin Taubman for 40 years. Just retired last year. These are great ideas, but these are not going to solve the affordability problem.
Yeah.
And what we're working on, I just created a nonprofit. I've been following Luke for years. What we're doing with a nonprofit called Equitable Ann Arbor Land Trust is try to build 20,000 housing units in Ann Arbor on public land owned by the city and the U. And we want to start with a couple of student teams next semester on Fuller Road between the medical campus and North Campus on those surface parking lots that you drive by on the bus every day. Those surface parking lots, there's 7 of them, are all owned by the city and the university. And our goals are to get the city and the university to put the land up as a community land trust. So you got 0 land for hundreds of years at $1 a year. That alone brings down the cost of the housing 10 to 25%. The next thing we're trying to do is to build it densely, 5 to 10, 20 stories or more, so that you get economies of scale. That can reduce the cost of the housing another 10 to 15%. Then we're trying to add ownership, not for rent, but ownership. If you permanently want to get people out of their balance sheet trap, their low income status, you got to give them equity. And there's not a better place for appreciation of equity than Ann Arbor at the market rate with limited supply and all of it growth by the U that drives up the value of real estate in the last 5 years, about 8% per year. So you got to give it to them as ownership. The next is it's got to be 30 to 50% affordable and workforce housing. Every development, with it blinded as to who's living where that's affordable or low income. And I know that if I were living there, I'd love to have mixed income people living near me. I'd love to have a grad student. One more minute. So if you're interested in knowing more about this, let Luke know, and I'll share with you our preliminary analysis of all these ideas that I think are planet worthy, something that could be done all over the globe. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Peter. I think that's right. I mean, just a quick response is, so my take on, say, this particular intervention is we have a relatively costly subsidy that is, not meeting its potential, right? So we're really losing out here. So this is very specific to the housing voucher program that we rely on. I mean, the Treasury, there's a program that's run through Treasury, the low income housing tax credit program, which ends up producing more affordable housing itself. I mean, it's challenging because, as you know, efforts to build affordable housing are met with resistance in places, and this is Baltimore and so on. But some work being done by Ann Owens in California suggests that some of these tax credits and some of these programs can be leveraged by developers to build affordable housing in higher opportunity areas. So I think there are a number of different tools in the toolkit we have to attend to, and then we won't. This is rhetorical almost, but why is it so expensive to build affordable housing? Okay, I'm going to move on. It's really, really, really expensive, and so I don't fully understand that, and many folks in the housing industry don't actually understand that either. Yeah.
I was kind of curious in a similar vein to how we could kind of take, because I was really impressed with the methodology of your study, and like the results are really promising. But it almost seems like not to diminish the work that your team is doing, it like your team did and is doing great work, but it kind of seems like, how do we best get people off sinking, like the people who win this, the 1 in 4 who win this lottery, how do we best get them off a sinking ship into these high opportunity ships or areas? So like, do you know of any work, or like, do you have any ideas of how we can like take this like impressive like mixed methods thing to kind of like reduce income segregation and like increase opportunities, so that it's in a sense, you know, because we can't move everybody out of these low opportunity zones. You know, like you said, it was like a costly voucher, and it's still only 1 in 4 people in these zones. So like, how do we make everywhere a high opportunity zone? Or how do we, you know, maybe start that project with this mixed methods approach?
So there's 2 big questions. One is, right, how do we do more mixed methods research? So that's its own, you know, set of questions, and, you know, having more attention to funding. What does it take to do this? Because it's not cheap. The other is, right, how do we have more places that have opportunities so you don't have to leave where you are to move to it, right? So this is complicated, and I think there are a number of reasons why we don't have a good handle on this answer yet. So one of the things I did at the behest of the Able Foundation president, Bob Embry, who was a real housing advocate and used to work at HUD, is I took a look at what happened in Sandtown, Winchester, and Baltimore. This, by the way, is not going to make you happy, what I'm about to say next. I'll just prepare you for that. This was an 8x9 block area in the 1990s that was targeted as one of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in the United States. And our best calculations, maybe $130 million was spent on Sandtown, Winchester, most of it in brick and mortar housing was built on site in place of, you know, dilapidated housing. So homeownership, you know, skyrocketed in Sandtown, Winchester. And then after 2008, so did foreclosures. So part of the question of homeownership is it's very complicated, and I don't think it's actually right for everyone. Whether renters should never have any equity is a separate set of policies, also complicated. But so what happened in Sandtown? So I think that we don't know. We have some sense of maybe there were some job training programs. There was a charter school, but there wasn't any really good implementation research. But what we could see just at bird's eye view when we compared Sandtown, Winchester to other similarly situated, slightly worse off, slightly better off neighborhoods in Baltimore, is that $130 million didn't do much. How is that possible? That was so that's actually what the Washington Post article that covered our article said. Not the best day of my life, but why not, right? And so I think we have had a hard time figuring out how to move the needle on place. What I presented today is sort of a person level policy. We've had a really hard time moving the needle on place. So could we have done better with $130 million? No doubt. Did people work really hard and get angry when this article came out and called me? Yes. And I said, how come nobody kept track of what happened here? We can't learn. We want to learn. I think it's easier for people are more inclined to follow money when it targets individual low-income folks than it is when, you know, it goes to poor communities. So we have less of a rigorous evidence base on how to make places high opportunity places. We have some exceptions that George Galster has done some work in Richmond, Virginia. We obviously know there's the exceptional Harlem Children's Zone, you know, exceptional in lots of ways. And there's still, additional work, with inclusive zoning programs that, say, Montgomery County, Maryland does, which takes a portion of it's a low-income tax credit units every year and uses them as housing policy stock, gives them to families. They're scattered throughout the county. So there are lots of other things, but the place-based stuff is challenging. So Laura Tack and some of her folks at Cornell are some of the first scholars to dig into this in a really rigorous way, using some of the same tax data that was used to build these opportunity maps. And so we stand to learn a lot, because what Laura was able to do was track who was living in neighborhoods, say in Sandtown or other places that actually received considerable amounts of money, and sort of what happened. Maybe it's that more happened than we realize. It's just people moved out. We should know that too. So not a satisfying answer, but, we then went with Kathy Eden, myself, Phil Garbone, and Christine Jang. A number of our students went out to 16 different neighborhoods in Baltimore where there was some sort of investment going on to try to figure out how legacy residents and newcomers could make community. And we'll run out of time before I could go into that. But this is the thing I think is really serious. To Peter's point as well, how do we deal with place? And usually the answer is and what I think about from even a civil rights perspective is the families saying CMTO shouldn't have to wait for us to figure it out. We should still have policies on the books that allow them to have better choices. But the ship, there aren't enough seats on the ship. Maybe it's still sinking. We could think about the metaphor that both of you are talking about. It's absolutely dire. And I'm just glad that for the first time, at least in my career, the housing itself is a public topic. Homeownership and crises that, when people own homes, that's something that's hit the news periodically, every decade or so. But housing shortages themselves are really, this is relatively new. And I think one optimistic takeaway is we're talking about it now in a way that we never have before. So I think I saw one more hand. I don't know if we have time or there's one more hand up.
So as I was, as you were presenting the qualitative data, I was sort of thinking, I've got a number of thoughts, and you've got me thinking differently about maybe adding a navigator and what the infant benefit we're doing in Flint. So I'm going to just have a few thoughts, and you can just decide whatever to answer, through there. But as I was reading the qualitative stuff, I was thinking it's not so much that they have navigators, it's really that they have high quality, intensive navigators who treat them with dignity and do well by them. And then when you showed the second RCT, I think that sort of confirmed what I thought, right? Which is like the minimal navigation did maybe a little better than the financial incentive, but not a lot. But the really good navigation did a lot better. And it'd be interesting to do a benefit cost analysis of like, what's the cost of the three, and see, since that's sometimes another way that we evaluate like the efficiency, I'd be curious if are we spending a lot more and getting a much better value? So that has me here at Michigan, we've done a lot of the community health worker stuff, which actually evaluates very well, but then often gets diluted when it goes to scale. And Seattle seems like they're actually interested in this stuff, and maybe it would be a good place to actually implement a high quality navigator. So I guess I'm curious, like, to me, an interesting question and I think it could only be started with qualitative work, is like, how do you actually make sure something like this spreads, the high quality version? Because there's some versions of the navigator that can actually be negative, right? If it's not dignified, I think you can, and it seemed like some of what the parents were pointing to was that, right? That most of the people in their life who maybe fill something like this role have not been there, have not sort of said, let's do this together. So it's a different approach. And so how do we scale it within systems that usually take a different approach, or some of the things I'm thinking about?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I think that, so some of the questions we're thinking about, right, are related to the cost benefit analysis. So there's some cost analysis in the paper. And, I said the marginal cost isn't high, but vouchers are expensive, right? And housing authorities are strapped for cash. And so, right, partnering with philanthropic folks with an evidence-based program is maybe more effective. So that was one way to go. But what does it take to be a good navigator? And how does it happen? So a little over 200 families were served, mostly by 4 women. Were they extraordinary women? Totally. I felt navigated, all right, when I spent time with them. And I thought, how, and searching for, who should be the navigator, right? Some social work experience is important. Some real estate knowledge is important. Knowing how to talk to owners, and, especially for even like large property management companies, property managers, right? In ways where, that they don't feel like they're going to lose out. Really important. But we're now in, so eight different sites. This is the community choice demonstration program. So we're going to learn the answer to that question over the next 5 years. and Apt Associates is running this evaluation. And so I'm on myself, Sarah Oppenheimer, Kathy O'Regan, Ingrid Ellen, a number of folks are on the team, the Seattle and King County Housing Authorities, and the navigators all sort of help try to provide some assistance to think this through. We expect to see some replicated success and some potential failures, all of which are important. And this is admittedly anecdotal, but gave me some hope as I went to a meeting a couple of weeks ago in DC, the Poverty Race Research Action Council so it's a lot of housing advocates, civil rights lawyers, some researchers, policy folks, to take stock on what we know about. These are technically called housing mobility programs. And some of the staff from a few of these sites, Rochester, Pittsburgh, Cuyahoga County, were there talking about the pilot. And I could see the special sauce. Some of it was there. And this is very anecdotal, right? Compared to all this talk about rigor. But we don't know yet. But then they were sort of taking us through some early lessons of how they were implementing what they took from CMTO, different strategies for navigating with landlords, sort of figuring out how to get landlords to take less rent in Rochester. This woman, Maria, is doing that. So I think there's possibility there in getting this done. How good does a navigator have to be? Is this irreplicable? I mean, we're going to find out. But I was there are some challenges that they're having as well. But I was optimistic that we'll see some additional success. And in fact, learn loads more than what we learned in Seattle for sure about new strategies, which is what happens when you actually take the work of practitioners seriously as well. So and then the question is, if we do, we've now a number of programs. Could we think through what they have in common? I know that Raj and I and other folks at Opportunities want to keep doing this work and learning more about the model so that we could get a better handle on how replicable it is across different policy domains. Seems to possibly be, but then also get a better sense of the cost benefit here, because that's key, right? So, but anyway, so those are some things that we're definitely thinking about. And then it's still that there are some lighter touch interventions that do work. Hail, for example, right, is a really, really impactful, relatively light touch intervention. So I think that keeping that balance too, right, is important for thinking about what domain, what kinds of intervention, and what kinds of policy resources we want to get more bang for the buck for, and what it would take.
Yeah, it was just, I'm thinking that you all may be in a particular position to try to analyze how do we end up with good navigators, right? What are the institutional forces? And this will be a nice set because it seems like you got some nice regional diversity and size diversity to be able to answer that. The financial incentives look pretty effective to me, right? It was still like an 8 percentage point increase. It's just,
so
you add the great navigator and it's just out of this world effective, it seemed like.
And it's still somebody answered the phone when a family member had to call to get financial assistance. So there's still an additional, it wasn't some automated system. So I think that there was something, made that a slightly more effective than it might have been some other way. But no doubt, because there's, a heterogeneous group, the families ranged, incomes were low, really low on average, but, families ranged, as Simone was saying, right, I'm not some needy case. Like, I actually have a car. Some families were much more move ready. So they, didn't necessarily need much. And so, right, again, that's a cost, another way of thinking of costs. And some families really needed to have that support through all these dips. And so that's another angle on this. I think we tried to really home in on some of the ingredients that are key here, but I think it's going to be, we're going to learn more from these sites. And then there's also a challenging question around, should the navigators be in-house to a housing authority? Should they be from a community group, nonprofit, which was the case in Seattle? They were not in-house. How does that work? Some institutions that may work better than others, because then you have a whole group of staff that have to rethink their model, and some staff may be more ready to do that than others. And so there's lots of different questions here. And this sort of other takeaway is heterogeneity matters. And we're going to probably learn exactly how that is. It may take a minute, several years, but we're excited to see the results from some of these cities.
Thank you so much. This has been really fantastic detail, and there's a really nice dovetail with a couple of the other talks in our series that have kind of focused on how to kind of overcome the barriers of getting people access to services. So I really appreciate it. I just want to note for people that Johns Hopkins is not located in Ann Arbor, which means we need to get Stefanie on a plane. So we don't really have a lot of time to talk to people after the talk. We need to get walking, but let's nonetheless thank her for an excellent talk.
Thank you. Feel free to email anytime with additional thoughts that you may be held to yourself. I know there's some students here, and I happen to know my students have much better ideas than I do most of the time, and that's why I rely on the brain trust. So feel free to react with comments or questions on email, and I would really welcome that too as another way to continue the conversation. Thank you.